So let's get right to it with Jeffrey Knox and Alexandra Wrage. Thanks so much for joining us. I do think, in having read a lot about and done some coverage of FCPA, my question for you, Jeffrey, we'll start off is the cure worse than the disease? So obviously there are a lot of social ills that come out of bribery, and Alexandra might want to weigh in about what those social ills are. But when you have the likes of Avon paying $350 million to investigate its operations around the world, when you have the likes of News Corp, my employer, paying upwards of $200 million to investigate its own predicament, you have to wonder, yes, there is a social good in eradicating bribery, but has it gone too far in terms of what justice is asking and what companies are willing to do?
Yeah, I think there's several layers to that question. I'm not able to speak on particulars regarding Avon or News Corp or other cases that we're looking at. You know, I will say that I'm often asked a question of, you know, does the punishment fit the crime, and is foreign corruption really that big a deal? Should it really be such a priority of the department? And frankly, the question is a little bit surprising to me at times because, you know, if let's say a U.S. company were to pay a U.S. government official several $million for a contract, wouldn't that seem like a big deal and something that the department should focus on significantly? And so my question back is often, what's the big difference as to whether it's a foreign official who's being bribed? And why trivialize foreign corruption when hardly anyone would trivialize domestic corruption? And my own personal view is that there's a strong public policy interest in vigorous enforcement of both domestic and foreign corruption. Having said that, and I think getting to your point, as a prosecutor, we have to exercise restraint and have a proportionate response to the conduct. I think in some instances, companies are spending too much money on investigations. It's not uncommon, frankly, for us to have a dialogue with a company that is purporting to be cooperating, and we might be focused on a very limited area of conduct or a certain region, and they come in and start reporting on this work they're doing around the globe. More power to them. You know, if they think they have a global problem and they want to identify it and solve it, that's great. But it's often not at our request, and at times can actually be counterproductive to what we're trying to do. We might have a very limited, narrow focus and have certain asks from a company and expectations from a company that's trying to cooperate. And the less they're focused on our conduct and focused on everything else, it slows our process down.
Interesting. So you say that the lawyers are getting out of control and investigating too much?
Well, I'm not sure I would characterize it necessarily as getting out of control. I think that might happen on occasion. I think in other instances, companies recognize that they have a problem, a broader problem, and their global investigations are undertaken not at our demand or insistence, but because they have decided as a sound business decision that they need to get on top of their assets and their employees.
Okay, Alexandra, let's bring you in here. Trace International does a lot of nonprofit work to help companies lower the cost, putting your words into my mouth, but lower the cost of doing this sort of work and sort of getting sort of a social good collectively out of compliance and understanding the marketplace. So what are the social ills that you see, and would you agree that the bills, the enforcement, the whole Baroque dance, as we saw in that question, has gotten to be a bit much?
Yeah, well, first of all, we're a business association, so although I think it's really important to recognize the social ills, because for some reason corruption gets this strange bye in this country where it gets dismissed as a white-collar crime that doesn't have the same sort of serious consequences as dumping effluents in rivers overseas or trafficking in human labor. But in fact, you know, bribery is a precondition for terrorism in most cases, false documentation, moving weapons. You see tainted pharmaceutical products getting onto foreign markets because of bribery. You see all sorts of problems that are much larger than the business community, but that affect the business community because you all have employees working overseas. It is a truly transnational crime. It crosses borders. in almost every respect, and it is a sort of barnacle crime with respect to everything else that goes on, whether that is human trafficking or trafficking, narco trafficking, and environmental ills. So to see companies dismiss it as, well, why are we paying so much attention to this, or worse, the condescension that comes with, well, it's just how business is done overseas. So that's why we're going to play along is distressing. Having said that, I'm in surprising agreement with Jeff on one point, which is I think there's a lot of scare tactics by law firms. So companies have heard enough about the hundreds of millions of dollars in fines generated by the FCPA over into the billions when you total it all up, and they find something and they go to their outside counsel, and their outside counsel says, well, we can't go into the DOJ until we've done this scorched earth review of all problems everywhere. Now, I don't know, I'm not privy to this, so I don't know how much of that is generated by the DOJ and how much is generated by law firms.
What's the most amazing thing you've heard about depth of investigation in a given matter?
It's all anecdotal, but in the case of one of our companies finding a fairly discreet, I know the Department of Justice doesn't generally like to talk about rogue employees, but we believe they're out there, a fairly discreet problem in one country, and by the time they were finished, they had reviewed that fact pattern, that scenario in every single country in which they operated to make sure it hadn't happened anywhere else. And in that case, it really was the bad actor that had generated the problem. It wasn't a lack of controls. And it was in the tens of millions of dollars before they even considered going into the Department of Justice.
All right, interesting.